There are operations that governments classify not because the revelation would endanger national security, but because the revelation would force a reckoning that institutions are not prepared to have. Operations whose existence, once acknowledged, raises questions about the nature of the states that conducted them, the people who carried them out, and the systems of oversight and the accountability that failed to prevent them. Nazi Germany conducted such operations. Some of them are well known, some of them are not, and some of them exist in a space between documentation and the silence that historians have spent decades trying to navigate. This is not a survey of the obvious. This is not a retelling of the Holocaust or the Blitzkrieg, or the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, important as those subjects are. This is a documentary about the operations that happened in the shadows of the better-known history, the ones conducted in the spaces between official orders and the unofficial action, the ones whose paper trails were deliberately destroyed, whose participants were sworn to silence, whose existence the Reich itself sometimes officially denied even while directing them. The secret operations, the ones that reveal, perhaps more clearly than the famous battles and the famous atrocities, how the Nazi state actually functioned, what it was actually capable of, and what it was willing to do in pursuit of its objectives when it believed no more one was watching. To understand why Nazi Germany conducted secret operations on the scale and of the nature that it did, you have to understand the fundamental structure of the regime. The Third Reich was not, despite its surface appearance of monolithic control, a unified state with a clear hierarchy of command. It was, in the words of the historian Hans Mommsen, a polycratic system, a regime of competing power centers, overlapping jurisdictions, and the deliberate institutional chaos that Hitler maintained partly by design and partly by temperament. The Wehrmacht, the SS, the Abwehr, the Foreign Office, the Gauleiter system, the various party organizations, all of these operated with significant autonomy in their own domains. And all of them engaged in operations that were not always fully known to or sanctioned by the others. This institutional chaos had a particular consequence for secret operations. It meant that operations could be initiated, funded, and conducted at levels below the explicit awareness of the full state apparatus. It meant that responsibility could be diffused across multiple organizations in ways that made accountability after the fact extremely difficult. And it meant that the regime had a capacity for deniability, not the modern political kind of deniability, but a genuine structural deniability rooted in the actual diffusion of operational authority that allowed it to pursue objectives through means that it could not officially acknowledge. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was the primary instrument of one of the most significant secret operations. It was commanded throughout most of the war by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, one of the most enigmatic and ultimately tragic figures. Canaris was a career naval officer who had served in the First World War with distinction, developed an expertise in intelligence work, and was in command the Abwehr in 1935. He built the organization into the primary intelligence and the special operations arm of the Wehrmacht, with networks of agents across Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. What makes Canaris extraordinary, and what makes the Abwehr's history so complex, is that there is substantial evidence that Canaris himself was, for significant portions of the war, working against the regime he nominally served. He was connected to the German resistance movement. He protected certain individuals from the SD and the SS who would otherwise have been arrested or killed. He may have deliberately passed inaccurate intelligence to Allied services on specific occasions, and he was ultimately arrested in 1944, following the failed July plot assassination attempt against Hitler, and executed in April tahun 1945 in the final weeks of the war. The question of how much Canaris did or didn't do to undermine the regime from within is one that historians have not fully resolved. What is clear is that the ABWER under his command conducted operations of extraordinary complexity and moral ambiguity, operations that served German military objectives while sometimes simultaneously serving other objectives that the regime would not have sanctioned had it understood them fully. One of the most significant of these operations unfolded not in Europe but in the Middle East and in North Africa, where Germany's strategic interests intersected with the complex politics of Arab nationalism in ways that have had consequences extending far beyond the Second World War. The German relationship with Arab nationalist movements during the Second World War was not simple or uniform. On one level, Germany had obvious strategic incentives to support any movement that created difficulties for Britain in the Middle East, which was a critical theater of the war given the importance of the Suez Canal, the oil of Iraq and the Persia, and the land routes connecting Britain's empire. On another level, the ideological framework of Nazism, with its racial hierarchy that placed Arabs significantly below the Aryan ideal, created genuine tension in any relationship based on partnership or equality. The figure who most dramatically embodied this tension was Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who had been a leading figure in Palestinian Arab politics since the 1920s, and who fled to Germany in 1941 after a failed pro-German coup attempt in Iraq. Al-Husseini spent the war years in Berlin and in German-occupied Europe, collaborating with the Nazi regime in ways that ranged from propaganda broadcasts aimed at Arab populations to the recruitment of Muslim volunteers for the Waffen-SS in the Balkans. He met Hitler, he met Himmler, he met Eichmann. The nature and the extent of his knowledge of and the complicity in the Holocaust has been debated by historians, but the documentary record most of these operations failed. The British security and the intelligence apparatus in the Middle East was significantly more capable than German intelligence appreciated. Agents were captured. Networks were penetrated. The coup attempt in Iraq in 1941 failed within weeks. But the operations left a legacy. The relationships established, the ideological connections made. The precedent of German intelligence engagement with Middle Eastern political movements, all of this continued to have echoes in the post-war period in ways that intelligence historians are still tracing. The most operationally sophisticated secret operations of the Nazi regime were conducted not by the Abwehr but by the SD, the Intelligence and the Security Service of the SS. The SD was commanded from 1939 until his assassination in 1942 by Reinhard Heydrich, who is one of the most chilling figures in the entire history of the Third Reich. Heydrich combined bureaucratic brilliance with a total absence of moral constraint in a way that made him, in the view of man historians, the most dangerous of all the senior Nazi leaders. He was the primary architect of the Holocaust's administrative structure. He was the chairman of the Wannsee Conference. He ran the SD with an efficiency and the ruthlessness that made it the most feared organization in the Reich. Before discussing the SD's secret operations, the assassination of Heydrich himself deserves examination, because it represents one of the most significant allied special operations of the entire war and one of the most consequential intelligence successes of the conflict. Operation Anthropoid was a British special operations executive mission that trained two Czechoslovak soldiers, Joseph Gabka and Jan Kubi, and inserted them into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in December 1941 with the specific mission of assassinating Heydrich. It was an assassination mission against a named senior Nazi official, something that the SUI and the broader Allied Special Operations apparatus rarely conducted at this level of target seniority. The operation succeeded. On Mei 27 1942, Gabka and the Kubi ambushed Heydrich's open-top Mercedes on a curve in the Prague suburb of Leib. Gabke's stun gun jammed. Kubi threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded beneath the car. Heydrich was wounded by shrapnel and the fragments of the car's upholstery. He survived the initial attack and he was taken to hospital. He died on June 4 from septicemia caused by his wounds. Gabka and the Kubi and the several colleagues hid in the crypt of the Cathedral of Saint Cyril and the Methodius in Prague until they were betrayed. Surrounded by SS and the Gestapo forces in overwhelming numbers and killed in the subsequent siege. The reprisals that followed Heydrich's assassination were among the most savage acts of collective punishment in the history of the German occupation of Europe. The village of Lidis was surrounded, its malpopulation shut, its women and the children transported to concentration camps, its buildings demolished, and its name struck from the records. The village of Leikai was similarly destroyed. Thousands of Czechs were arrested, interrogated, and in many cases executed. The Nazi regime's response to the killing of its most senior official in occupied Europe was designed to demonstrate that resistance had a cost so catastrophic that no more calculation of benefit could justify it. But Operation Anthropoid had consequences beyond the immediate reprisals. It removed from the Nazi command structure the man who was perhaps its most operationally capable senior figure. The SD under Heydrich had been developing into an intelligence and the security apparatus of genuine sophistication, one that was beginning to extend its reach and the capability in ways that the Abwehr could not match. His desk created a vacuum that was eventually filled by Onskaltenbrunner, a competent but less brilliant figure whose tenure never matched the operational sophistication that Heydrich had been developing. The SD's most significant secret domestic operation was the systematic penetration and the destruction of the German resistance movement. This is not a simple story of heroic resistors and the brutal oppressors, though it contains both. It is a complex and the often tragic story of a surveillance and the counterintelligence operation that was, in purely technical terms, remarkably effective. The German resistance to Hitler was real, sustained, and far more extensive than the post-war mythology of collective German guilt, or the wartime Allied assessment of a uniformly Nazi German population would suggest. It encompassed military officers, diplomats, churchmen, trade unionists, communists, conservatives, and the ordinary citizens who opposed the regime for different reasons and by different means. The resistance produced assassination attempts, sabotage operations, intelligence passed to Allied services, and the sustained effort to build the networks that would be needed to govern Germany after the regime fell. The SD's penetration of these networks was systematic and ultimately devastating. Informants were placed. Arrested resistors were turned. The Gestapo's methods of interrogation, with the surviving accounts of the period make clear, were extraordinarily brutal. Produced information that led to further arrests that produced further information. The July 23, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, the most nearly successful of the multiple attempts on his life, was followed by an investigation and the wave of arrests that rolled up much of what remained of the organized German resistance. The executions that followed, conducted with deliberate brutality at Plzeňsky prison in Berlin using thin piano wire to ensure a slow and painful death, killed men of the most significant figures of the German resistance movement. But the SDS surveillance operation against the resistance had a dimension that went beyond the domestic penetration of opposition networks. The Ruta Kapelle, the Red Orchestra, was a Soviet intelligence network operating in German-occupied Europe that the SD was trying to penetrate and destroy. The network, which included agents in Berlin, Brussels, Paris, and Switzerland, transmitted military intelligence of significant value to Moscow throughout the Nazi-Soviet Pact and who became extremely valuable intelligence assets after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. The SD's hunt for the Red Orchestra networks was one of the most extensive counterintelligence operations of the war. It involved radio direction finding to locate clandestine transmitters, the arrest and the intensive interrogation of identified network members, and eventually the penetration of the networks themselves through turned agents. The operation succeeded in identifying and destroying several of the network's components. Dozens of people were arrested, tortured, and executed. The network in Brussels was effectively destroyed. Elements of the Berlin network were penetrated, but the Swiss component of the network, known as the Lucy Ring, proved resistant to SD penetration throughout the war. The Lucy Ring, operating through a network of sources whose identities remain not fully established to this day, transmitted intelligence to Moscow that is believed to have included information about German order of battle, operational plans, and the command decisions at a level of accuracy and the timeliness that was extraordinary. The most dramatic example was the intelligence about the German Kursk offensive in 1943, which Soviet military planners received with sufficient detail and advance notice to prepare the defensive positions that ultimately defeated the operation. Where the Lucy Ring's intelligence came from has been debated for decades. Some historians believe the sources were within the German High Command itself. Others have suggested British involvement, that the intelligence was passed through the Lucy Ring as a way of providing Moscow with information derived from Enigma decrypts without revealing that the Allies had broken the German codes. The truth, if it has been established, has not been fully disclosed in any public historical account. Operation Bernhard was one of the most audacious and in some ways most revealing of Nazi Germany's secret operations, because it reveals the extent to which the regime was willing to use criminal methods as instruments of state policy while maintaining a surface of institutional legitimacy. It was a counterfeiting operation. Specifically, it was an operation to produce the most convincing counterfeit British pound notes in history, in sufficient quantities to collapse the British economy. The operation was conceived in the early years of the war and developed under the direction of the SS. It was conducted at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, where a group of prisoners, primarily Jewish, who had professional skills relevant to the technical challenges of high-quality forgery, were assembled under conditions that provided them with relatively better treatment than the general camp population in exchange for their participation. The inmates who refused participation faced the standard consequences of camp discipline. The ones who participated lived in marginally better conditions while producing, under SS supervision, what became the largest counterfeiting operation in history. The technical challenge was formidable. British pound notes of the period were produced on specific paper with specific chemical properties, printed with specific inks using specific techniques, and the incorporated security features that had been designed to make counterfeiting extreme. The operation needed to replicate all of these features convincingly enough to pass in normal commercial circulation. It eventually succeeded. The notes produced at Sachsenhausen were of sufficient quality that they circulated in Europe without detection and they were used to fund German intelligence operations in neutral countries. The intended scale of the operation, the flooding of the British economy with counterfeit currency sufficient to cause hyperinflation and the economic collapse, was never achieved. The logistical challenges of introducing the notas into British circulation in sufficient quantity proved beyond the operation's reach. And by the time the production was reaching its full capacity, the war situation had deteriorated to the point where other priorities overtook the currency warfare plan. But the notice that war produced had a long afterlife. When the war ended and the SS personnel responsible for the operation attempted to dispose of the evidence, large quantities of the counterfeit currency were dumped in Lake Toplitz in Austria along with other documents and the materials. Divers have recovered materials from the lake over the decades since. The counterfeit notice were still appearing in circulation in Europe years after the war ended. The story of Operation Bernhard was turned into a film in 2007 that won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. The film focused appropriately on the moral complexity faced by the prisoners who participated, who were producing currency for a regime that was simultaneously killing their families and the communities, under conditions where refusal meant death and the compliance meant survival at a moral cost that could not be calculated. Operation Willy was one of the most bizarre and in some ways most revealing operations the Nazi regime conducted, because it reveals the extent to which personal obsessions at the highest levels of the regime could generate major secret operations of questionable strategic value. Its target was the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII of Great Britain, who had abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson and who was, by 1940, serving as the governor of the Bahamas, a posting that the British government had arranged with the specific intention of keeping him at a safe distance from European politics during the war. Hitler and Ribbentrop had convinced themselves, on the basis of some genuine evidence and a great deal of wishful thinking, that the Duke was sympathetic to Germany and that if Britain could be persuaded or forced into a negotiated peace, the Duke might be reinstated as king as part of the settlement. The Duke had visited Germany in 1937, met Hitler, toured industrial facilities, and he made comments that were interpreted by his German hosts as sympathetic to the Nazi regime. Whether those interpretations were accurate, whether the Duke's actual political positions justified the German assessment, is a question that historians have examined extensively without fully resolving. In the summer of 1940, when the Duke and the Duchess were in Lisbon awaiting their transfer to the Bahamas, the SS conducted an operation to make contact with the Duke, assess his willingness to remain in Europe rather than taking up his Bahamas posting, and if possible persuade him to a course of action that would serve German interests. The operation involved SS agents in Lisbon, intermediaries from the Spanish and the Portuguese aristocracy, and the communications through back channels that reached to the senior levels of the Spanish government. The operation failed. The Duke sailed for the Bahamas. Whether his decision to go was influenced by British pressure, by his own calculation of his interests, or by a genuine loyalty to Britain despite everything, is impossible to determine with certainty from the available evidence. What is clear is that the German intelligence effort around the Duke of Windsor in the summer of 1940 was real, documented, and taken seriously enough by the British government that the relevant files were among the last wartime intelligence records to be released, not occurring until decades after most other wartime files had been made available. The Lebensborn program represents a different category of secret operation, one that operated not through agents and the tradecraft but through the systematic machinery of state social engineering. Lebensborn, which translates roughly as Fount of Life, was an SS program established in 1935 under Himmler's direct supervision with the stated purpose of increasing the birth rate of children who met the regime's racial criteria for Aryan purity. The program's activities included the operation of maternity homes where unmarried women carrying children fathered by SS men could give birth in conditions that ensured the children would be registered as Aryan and be brought up within the program's care rather than being aborted or placed for adoption outside the system. This domestic component of Lebensborn, while deeply revealing of the regime's ideology, is relatively well documented and studied. The more hidden and the more disturbing component was the abduction and the Germanization of children from occupied territory. In Poland, Norway, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere, children who were assessed as meeting the racial criteria for Aryan classification were taken from their families, sometimes by force and sometimes through deception, transported to Germany, given new German names and identities, placed with German families or in institutions and raised as Germans. The numbers involved are estimated at between 50,000 and 200,000, though the extreme variation in these estimates reflects the incomplete documentation of an operation that was deliberately conducted without systematic record-keeping at the operational level. What happened to these children after the war was one of the most complex and the painful consequences of the entire Lebensborn operation. Some were found and returned to their surviving families or communities of origin. Many were not found or were found too late, after they had grown up as Germans with German identities, German language, German families, and no more memory of their origins. The trauma of identity for those who were found, who suddenly learned that everything they believed about who they were was a lie constructed by the regime that had stolen them, is a subject that psychologists and his departments, all of these were expressions of a particular kind of state, one that had convinced itself that it had not only the right but the obligation to pursue its objectives by any means available, without constraint of law, morality, or the conventions that even cynical states typically maintain, to preserve their legitimacy in their own eyes. What the record of Nazi Germany's secret operations reveals, taken as a whole, is not primarily a story of operational sophistication, though some of the operations were genuinely sophisticated. It is a story of the kind of operations that become possible when institutional restraint is entirely absent, when there is no more internal check, no more legal accountability, no more professional ethic that stands between a regime's objectives and the means available to pursue them. The operations that are well documented are almost certainly a fraction of what was actually conducted. The deliberate destruction of records at the war's end, the deaths of the people who carried out the operations, the classification policies of the post-war Allied powers who found the revelations inconvenient, all of these factors mean that the historical record is permanently incomplete. There are operations that we know existed but whose details remain largely unknown. There are operations that we know were planned but do not know whether they were executed. And these are almost certainly operations that we do not know existed at all, whose records are gone, whose participants are dead, whose existence the archives do not reveal. That irreducible incompleteness is itself a form of historical testimony. It tells us that the full scope of what the regime was willing to do has never been, and probably can never be, fully known. It tells us that the silence in the archives is not the absence of history but a different kind of historical record, the record of what was deliberately made to disappear. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted the most visible crimes. They established the legal precedents that international humanitarian law has built on in the decades since. They provided a framework of accountability that, however imperfect, was more than had existed after any previous comparable catastrophe. But they did not and they could not address the full scope of what Nazi Germany had done in the shadows, because the shadows were, by design, places where the evidence had been destroyed. Operation Paperclip took the scientists whose knowledge the Allied powers wanted and they gave them no identities, no lives, and the new employers without examining too closely what they had done to acquire that knowledge. The rattliness moved the war criminals whose escapes suited various Cold War interests without those interests being clearly articulated or examined. The intelligence files on specific operations were classified not because the revelation would endanger current operations but because the revelation would embarrass current allies or raise questions about the conduct of post-war justice that no more one in authority was prepared to answer. History accumulates. The files are released, eventually, in fragments and in stages. Historians piece together what can be pieced together. The picture that emerges is always incomplete and that is the nature of secret operations. They are a secret not only from the enemies against whom they are directed. They are a secret from history itself, designed to leave no more trace, to deny posterity the evidence of what was done and who did it and what it cost. Nazi Germany's secret operations reveal, in their totality, a state that operated in the dark by preference, that chose concealment over accountability at every level of its function, and that believed, with the particular confidence of a regime that faced no more internal constraint, that the darkness in which it operated was permanent. It was not permanent. The archives opened. The survivors spoke. The graves were found. The documents survived despite the burning. Not all of them, not enough of them, but enough to know that the darkness was larger than we see, enough to know that what we know is not all there was, and enough to know that the accounting, however incomplete, is still being done. That may be the most important thing the secret operations of Nazi Germany tell us. Not about the regime, about us, about the obligation that falls on the living to keep looking, to keep asking, to refuse to accept the silence that the perpetrators intended as a permanent condition. The files are still being opened. The questions are still being asked. The silence is still being broken. It is not finished. It may never be entirely finished, but the work continues. And the continuing of that work is itself a form of answer to everything the regime believed about the permanence of its darkness. The darkness did not hold, and yet must not be allowed to hold again.